Section 8 buildings were actually more likely to be torched than the average building in the private market, right?
What's next for a neighborhood under siege? We'll have to wait and see. Reporting live, Sadie Sinclair, Channel 7 News.
We start with a quote from Frantz Fanon, and the hits just keep on coming. In this new book by Bench Ansfield called Born in Flames, it covers a topic that's been the subject of multiple episodes of this podcast, landlord arson. I'm going to start this episode a little bit differently and read from the introduction. Smearing black pigment onto their hands and faces, landlord Imre Oberlander and his associate Yeshai Weber prepared to torch one of the former's 6 buildings in the South Bronx. The white incendiaries believed blackface would offer them cover, like a perverse kind of safety gear. At 4 a.m., on a Friday morning, the two men cruised down Southern Boulevard en route to the targeted building. They hoped the twilight would provide further protection, but when they drove past a police car, their broken taillight caught the attention of the officers on patrol. Pulling them over on the wide thoroughfare, the policemen saw 2 Hasidic men from Williamsburg made up in blackface, one wearing a wig, and proceeded to search the car. They found 2 firebombs, crude incendiary devices made out of gasoline, gunpowder, and a timing device. Oberlander became one of the first landlords charged in connection with the decade's epidemic of arson, as the New York Times had begun to call it. Though the Bronx, in particular, had been burning for years by this point, authorities remained so oblivious to the root causes that they initially suspected Oberlander and Weber of being spies en route to the Soviet diplomatic compound 10 miles away at the opposite end of the borough. It is true that the firestorm involved vast conspiracies, transnational dealings, and a doctrine of containment, but it all had little to do with the Cold War. What drove the arson wave was profit. Oberlander had collected $125,000, nearly $750,000 in 2024 dollars in insurance payouts from 21 separate fires between 1970 and 1975. All his claims were paid off without a murmur from the insurance company, rallied Bronx District Attorney Mario Marola, warning without hyperbole that this was just a drop in the bucket. So that is just a taste from the beginning of the book, and Bench is going to talk more about the larger concepts within it. And here's where I send my gratitude to Sky, AL, Kristen, and Keen, recently subscribers on Patreon, patreon.com/sadfrancisco. Please consider going there and joining the 4 people I just mentioned. As somebody who makes media that's critical of capitalism, I don't expect to ever get rich off of what I do, but a few bucks a month definitely helps me pay the bill. Bench, how did you become aware of the phenomenon of landlords setting fire to their own buildings?
Yeah, well, I was first tipped off to this history by a neighbor of mine in West Philly, where I was living soon after graduating college. And we were talking about the bombing of the MOVE organization in 1985, the Philadelphia Police Department's aerial bombing of the MOVE org. And she mentioned to me, she said something along the lines of, well, this didn't just happen here. Bronx landlords also burned their homes down. And I just, it didn't totally compute for me. Like I couldn't really understand like why that would happen if it's true that like it happened on the scale that she was describing, and also like what the relationship was between these 2 pretty seemingly different genres of fire. And yeah, it was 2008 when we had this conversation. I had just graduated into the Great Recession, which, of course, was sparked by the subprime mortgage crisis. So I was like pretty attuned to how the real estate market collapsing could blow up the global economy. Um, and the kind of uh, explosion of questions in my mind just kind of sat there for like 5 years. I didn't really look into it. I just kind of wondered. And eventually it became kind of intolerable, and I started looking into it just out of curiosity. And I couldn't believe that what I found, that my neighbor like wasn't exaggerating. This was indeed a widespread phenomenon, and it wasn't just the Bronx. This was happening in cities across the country, from the Bay Area to Seattle to Denver to Philly. And um, it took me about 10 years to conduct all the research necessary to write the book. And most of that was spent following the money in the insurance markets. And, I want to like pause and maybe recognize that like seemingly no like sane person would want to think more about insurance than is absolutely necessary, or at least like if you're if
Sure.
you're like trying to be kind to yourself, why would you ever do that? Like literally you buy insurance so you don't have to think about it. It's like incredibly boring and soul sucking and like seemingly so complex. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to see that it's, everywhere, hiding in plain sight, pretending to be not worth thinking about, but actually having um, um, this enormous impact on our infrastructure, our behavior, our relationships, our lives. And that's, I kind of fell into this insurance rabbit hole and have yet to emerge.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for doing this research because, like you said, insurance is in all of our lives. And in the case of the topic of the book and these landlord arsons, it seems like without this insurance mechanism, a lot of these fires would never have been initiated. Maybe most of these fires would have never been initiated. And it's the book really looks at like, yeah, the financialization of a bare necessity that everybody needs, housing, and how the economy around real estate has set us up for a situation where landlords are burning tenants out of their houses. And You mentioned the Bronx. A lot of the book is set during a time in the Bronx that the mainstream media dubbed an epidemic of fire. Could you describe the scale of the epidemic and the problem of landlord arson?
Yeah, so precise numbers are difficult to come by, but the number of housing units lost in in the Bronx even ran into the tens of thousands. The Bronx lost over 100,000 units to fire in a landlord abandonment over the course of about a decade. And I did some like back of the envelope calculations, and that's roughly equivalent to Berkeley, California, like burning down twice over. And again, this wasn't just happening in the Bronx. San Francisco, between 1972 and 1977, had a 700% increase in arson. 700%.
Wow.
Yeah. So, the scale of it's kind of beyond comprehension. When you think about like how many films and history books and lesson plans have been written about the uprisings of the prior decade, of the 1960s, how central those events are to our historical imagination, and rightly so. Like they're pivotal in history of social movements and cities. Um, but when you compare that to the arson wave of the 70s, which was actually many orders of magnitude larger in its destructiveness, and yet there's barely any kind of historical remembrance at all anywhere. And when it is remembered, it's only isolated to the Bronx. It's particularly shocking. And of course, the pervasiveness of this across the country had to do with the changing economics of rental real estate in the 1970s on a national scale. So by the 70s, landlords were really feeling the accumulated effects of decades of disinvestment and mortgage redlining and white flight and industrial relocation, otherwise known as capital flight, and their profit margins were getting squeezed. They were shrinking, and at the time, at least in New York, and honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if the same dynamic happened in San Francisco. Landlords just blamed rent control. And like it became kind of a tool for them. They would point to the fires, they would point to abandonment as like a see, like we told you rent control was bad.
Right.
But of course, and this is kind of what a national study can help show is that it wasn't rent control because this was happening over the country and rent control exists almost nowhere.
Right.
The
Right.
problem wasn't rent control. The problem was all of these accumulated crises that were coming to a head. The problem was redlining. The problem was capital flight. And once landlords realized that they had little chance of really selling their buildings for the prices they desired. It was more that than the rental rolls that went into this calculus. They looked for ways to liquidate their assets as quickly as possible, and arson became one such way. Although there were others, including selling the building to some unsavory kind of bottom feeder of the real estate industry, who then was likely to burn the building down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And so in all these cases, yeah, I mean, the landlords are the ones in control. They're the ones that, in seeking profit, yeah, are willing to go to the lengths that we see throughout the book, which included like uh, creating multiple arson rings that were working the same time in New York City in the 70s. Um, Thought we could maybe like clue people into one of the rings that you focus on, which is called the Bald Ring.
Yeah.
Who was involved with that?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, there, like you said, there are these number of pretty spectacularly scaled arson rings that were exposed throughout the 1970s, and the Bald Wing is probably the largest such syndicate in New York history. It involves numerous landlords, of course, along with lawyers and former cops and insurance industry personnel were implicated, and importantly, also torches. So torches were the folks that landlords hired to do the burning for them because they mostly didn't want to get their hands dirty, and they were usually young people of color from that building or living nearby. And the fact that it was like that, to be a torch was like a job title is telling. Like the fact that that a job title exists at all, I think is pretty indicative of how common it was for landlords to hire out this work, to get somebody else to do the burning for them, and they did that to insulate themselves, to avoid prosecution, because of the way that the laws around arson prosecution worked. It was exceedingly difficult to incriminate anybody besides the person who like literally was holding the match. Um, but yeah, so I should also clarify. I think that these arson rings, were like I said, like spectacular, in the most sinister sense, and they certainly deserve our attention. But and we know the most about them. But most landlord arsons weren't actually carried out by these kind of far-reaching rings. They were rather carried out by small-time landlords who were making like a pretty so-called rational, like in the like economics, like an economist would call this a rational decision, that it made more economic sense to squeeze the money from the insurance company than it did using rental income
Right.
or equity. And I think that I kind of wanted to add that caution because there's no shortage of like conspirators here, but I I really want to caution uh, listeners and readers that there's like a limited benefit in viewing this as like a conspiracy, which is like what like the genre conventions of true crime would like have
Sure.
us do, you know, that like yes, human hands like lit these fires, but they were set in motion by forces like far more impersonal and far reaching than like a simple criminal cabal, right? Like that this was the carnage of financialization. And I think of it less of like a it's less of a who done it than a what done it ultimately.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, because I mean, you tie it back to some of the original insurers in England hundreds of years ago, with
Totally.
Lloyd's of London and that system. The book also, yeah, I mean, one of the main takeaways is just how financialization and the insurance industry, being an industry, how it's been complicit and also incentivized landlord arson. Could you generally just speak to what the purpose of insurance is, and then talk about some of the major ways that we see it manipulated
Hmm.
under under capitalism and the financialization of everything?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think of insurance as sort of capitalism's first line of defense against unexpected ills, right? Against risk. Um, at one point in the book, I call it capitalism's first responder. And it's this very potent tool for absorbing and diffusing and transferring risk, transferring economic shocks. But importantly, insurance does not insure the well-being or the health or the integrity of the insured property, right? The thing itself. Like it doesn't uh, it's not the investment is not in that thing. The investment is in the financial interest in that thing, in that property.
Right.
And I think that's pretty key to understanding how the insurance incentives in the 1970s got so warped, you know, so perverse. um, so to back up a bit, some maybe yeah, like to back up some 300 years to the origins of fire insurance. Um, we go to the Great Fire of London, which destroyed a huge portion of the city's housing, and sparked this kind of boom in the fledgling property insurance industry that was absolutely essential for urban growth on both sides of the Atlantic, you know, over the next centuries. And this is also kind of what ends up prompting Lloyd's of London, which you mentioned, prompting it to come into being. And for the next 3 centuries, for the next 300 years, the profitability of an insurance firm was pretty like straightforward. It hinged on the ratio between the losses that that company paid out for its policyholders for you know for claims that they filed versus the premiums that they took in from those same policyholders, like pretty much what you would expect. And this is called the loss ratio. It's definitely more complicated than that when you take into account overhead, and there, you know, there's many formulas that underwriters and actuaries use, but that's like the essential concept. And in the 1970s, that began to change. And this is where financialization comes in. Financialization really reconfigures how not just insurance firms interact with the broader economy. It changes how like where it changes where the profit center is within the industry. So companies began to make more money in the gains that they would make from their investments in money markets and bonds and stocks and real estate and other investments. Those sorts of investments were generating far more profit than they were ever making on the underwriting side. And so, because they just wanted to keep money funneling towards those investments, they began to lower their underwriting standards. They began to care less about losses that would be produced from that underwriting. They had kind of an insatiable hunger for premiums. They were inhaling premiums. Because those premiums were the seed money for their investments. And so long as they kept that premium churn going, they could lower their underwriting standards and they could tolerate higher losses.
Yeah. So yeah, like basically continuing to today, like separating the concept of the thing is what they're doing from the actual thing itself, or the like, yeah, you mentioned like the value of the thing versus the value of the building, for example, versus the building itself becomes the thing that they are concentrated on.
Exactly.
And making things like more conceptual and less like based in the actual world, yeah, like it has led to all of these problems. And again, yeah, made it uh brought us a lot of these fires. And another thing that uh led to the burning of the Bronx, that a lot of people listening to this will have heard of, is the idea of redlining, racist redlining. Oh, sorry. One sec. There's a little static.
Yeah.
Okay. Uh, you also read about the movements against racist redlining in the 60s and 70s. All of these housing justice movements led to some closer look by the government at insurance, the insurance industry, and led to these insurance equality policies like fair insurance plans. So, whereas people in certain areas, people of certain races would not have been able to get an insurance policy, these new government initiatives like mandated that uh, there would be some sort of insurance policy for someone who traditionally wouldn't have been able to get one. And uh, it effectively, like sounds like a great thing. Like all of these people who are trying to get a house, who, black people like might were previously not able to get mortgages or and as well as insurance, and this was like supposed to be a solution to that. Um, how did these policies, though, as you talk about in the book, policies like FAIR, they served as counterinsurgency tactics, as you mentioned, against the housing justice movements of the 60s and 70s. And I was wondering if you could, yeah, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, of course. So the FAIR Plan might be familiar to many of your listeners. I assume that many have ties to California. And in California, the FAIR Plan has been like in the headlines nonstop, especially since January's fires in LA. And this is true not just in California. FAIR Plans are fixtures of the headlines in other states that are also on the front lines of climate change. Florida and Louisiana, the Carolinas, New York. Um, and most associate FAIR Plans with these kinds of climate-related disasters. Um, in California, it's the FAIR Plan ended up becoming so popular and taking on being so overexposed to climate risk that it just received $1 billion bailout. So it's big. It's majorly in the news, but few are aware that it was created as really a band-aid to a very different type of conflagration, and that was the uprisings of the 1960s, right? Which I was mentioning before, and are really tied to this history in some unexpected ways. So insurance redlining by the 1960s was nothing new. Insurers had been redlining cities for decades, but the insurance redlining is slightly different from the redlining that most people refer like what they mean when they say redlining, which is mortgage redlining. And one of the objects of the book is kind of disentangling those and showing that on the insurance side, it's actually a somewhat different history that has never really been told. And what happened when the uprisings of the 60s broke out and hit cities year after year for many years straight is that insurers basically were like sent into a racialized panic. The losses weren't actually that large compared to like many of the other catastrophes or many of the catastrophes that insurers deal with on a regular basis, but they were just totally freaked out and they started pulling out of cities altogether, just totally fleeing them. And this was really just like a huge acceleration of this redlining dynamic. And in response, when Lyndon Johnson organized the Kerner Commission in 1967, this was a federal body that was assembled to study the rebellions. There was an independent kind of offshoot of the Kerner Commission that was focused solely on insurance. And that offshoot proposed something called the FAIR Plan to keep cities insured. And it was framed as an anti-redlining measure. It was framed as a racial justice measure. And its proponents thought that it would help put out the flames that were overtaking American cities. But when you kind of read beneath, between the lines, they're actually hoping that insurance would extinguish the radicalism that was also emanating out of Black and Brown communities in these years, right? And I think of it as a sort of financialized form of counterinsurgency, a mode of incorporation that sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly aimed to quell Black rebellion.
Right, right. And so the insurance industry gets posed as this solution to a lot of the asks of the housing justice movement, which had built up quite a bit of goodwill. They had been bringing things like landlord arson to the media, getting more of a spotlight on it, and then uh, instead of perhaps more radical policies like rent control or vacancy control or public housing, it gets sort of enveloped by this industry effort, this insurance industry effort. Um, yeah, just to think of like how different housing might look if that hadn't happened. It's oof. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, some of the just as like an aside, like I appreciate how you kind of look at some of the language that is indicative of the work that the housing justice had done, and the co-optation by
Mhm.
corporations and the government. Like you mentioned, how when it became like sort of politically incorrect to say that uh, we're going to avoid basically giving policies to people in like black neighborhoods, they started using this term riot prone neighborhoods
Yeah.
to describe the exact same geographical area.
Exactly. Even in places that didn't experience any sort of rebellion, they too were riot prone simply because they were predominantly Black neighborhoods.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's, yeah. It's,
And that
it,
was the Bronx, actually. That was, the Bronx was a predominantly Black and brown neighborhood that experienced almost no major uprising in the 1960s. It was very minimal compared to most other cities, other parts of New York, even. And yet it was so affected by that actuarial designation, by being considered
yeah.
riot prone and then getting inundated with this special insurance that was for riot prone neighborhoods, which, did it in. Like it's pretty dramatic.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I think the book does a great job of laying that out. Another point that you look at is how Section 8 housing seemed to be more likely to be targeted for arson than
Yeah.
other types of housing. And on the other end, public housing was maybe least targeted by landlord arson in the 70s in the Bronx. Why why is this?
I'm so glad you asked this question. And I've been on a number of podcasts, and not I don't feel like this gets enough attention. For me, this is the thing that first like made my head explode when I was in the beginning of this research. This finding that in New York, the the housing authority, NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, is the largest landlord in the city. It's one of the largest landlords in the world, really. And it was virtually untouched by this wave of arson, such that like you would have blocks in the Bronx where nearly every building burned down besides those that were owned by the state, right? Which is just totally bonkers to
Yeah,
consider and
yeah,
really cuts against like every sort of dominant narrative about public housing in the late 20th century, right? The 1970s, this is like the downfall decade for public housing, right?
right.
Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis is demolished in these years. The federal government declares that they'll never build another unit of public housing again. And these kinds of, so-called failures of public housing, which were often just the result of under funding and under resourced of being under resourced, they're so problematized by this finding that the greatest defense that a building could have against the arson wave was being owned by the state. Like literally the safest place to be was public housing. That is so different from how safety public housing equation usually goes, right? In
Right.
these kind of dominant narratives. And then meanwhile, as cities are tearing down their public housing, they begin to rely more on Section 8 vouchers as the vehicle for affordable housing. And this is a
Right.
Nixonian kind of bait and switch that happens, I think, in 1974.
Effectively like a
And
public-private partnership is
exactly,
Section 8.
100%. These were effectively they were government subsidies that were pouring into the pockets of private landlords. It was a landlord subsidy, right? It shored up urban real estate, and Section 8 buildings, the new engine for affordable housing, supposed to be the kind of floor that prevents people from slipping through the cracks and becoming homeless. Section 8 buildings were actually more likely to be torched than the average building in the private market, right? And so more than like those two data points together, more than really any other history I have encountered as an urban historian, underscores, I think, the dangers of commodifying housing and shelter, right?
Yeah.
Of this basic human need, the utter failure of the private market to ensure that those needs can be met. I think it really offers a singular indictment of that private market for housing, our over reliance on it, and its immiserating effects.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think if people read this book and then come away not thinking like, okay, one of the big solutions here is just to build more public housing, then I feel like they missed a major point.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, thank you for laying that out so beautifully in the book. I I also I didn't send you this question ahead of time, but like you said at the beginning, like this is history that gets like that seemingly disappeared. Like you
Mhm.
mentioned how like you learned about Move and then you learned about the Bronx sort of through like word of mouth. But
Mhm.
certainly I didn't learn any of this in history in high school in California. Uh, and uh, and I think there's probably there are reasons for that. One place that we did, you know, have hints that this was like a major problem in the 1970s was pop culture.
Hmm.
We had like you talk about like some of the music of the time and the that talks about this fire epidemic, basically makes references to it. And the book itself is named after the film Born in Flames. Wondering if you would describe briefly what happens in Born in Flames for people who haven't seen it. Pitch why people should watch Born in Flames.
Oh, it's the greatest. I think it's my favorite movie, and amazingly, it just was re-released. It was put on Blu-ray by the Criterion Collection, like I think last week, and so it's easier to watch, and it is a like it's the film of my dreams. I don't know why that no film has matched it. It was made in 1983, and it's like it still is in my mind one of the best depictions of the promises of radical mobilization and the limits like leftist discourse and leftist movements in really making sure that everybody is like making sure that nobody's disposable. So the protagonist in the film is this radical student at Lehman College in the Bronx, who gets killed basically because after this socialist revolution, racism and misogyny remained rampant. And I think that it's a really powerful reminder of how necessary it is that we need to keep each other safe and the multiplicity of tactics that we have at our disposal in order to do that. There's really incredible, like all women bike anti-rape brigades. It's just I can't recommend it more highly enough. It remains evergreen. And if anything comes from this podcast, please check out that amazing Lizzie Borden film.
Cool. Yeah. Well, we'll link to where people can find that on Criterion. Yeah. Also a fan. I need to rewatch it. And yeah, the book inspired me to do that. And yeah, last, I mean, if people want to follow the work that you do, how can they do that?
Yeah, I'm on social media. I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky. I recently joined Instagram. I also have a website, and my email is really very available. It's on. I'm a professor at Temple, so it's available on my institutional website, and I love getting emails from readers.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah. Thank you again so much. I hope everybody goes out and reads this book. They have it at the public library, although it's lots of hold since it just came out. But yeah, check out Born in Flames. Thank you again, Bench.
Thank you so much. It's really been wonderful talking with you.
Thank you for listening to the show, and especially thank you to everyone who is contributing over at patreon.com/Sad Francisco. You're making it possible for Sad Francisco to exist. And if you're not already a member, think about joining. Again, it's patreon.com/Sad Francisco.